Creativity is a complex soup of attitude, skill, belief, and experiences. IDEO's David Kelly says that we get placed into a category of creative haves or have-nots, often at some point in our lives. It might be in school, it might be in our university education, it might well be when you get into the workplace. And if you work in the creative industries, you might well have the word creative in your job title. So if you have creative in your job title, what does that mean for everybody who doesn't have creative in theirs? Does it mean they're not expected to be creative? Of course it doesn't, but it starts to show how we can just pigeonhole people into what they can and can't do. And often our own view of our own abilities, our own creative abilities, is actually foisted on us or passed on to us by somebody else saying to us, well, I don't think that's a great idea, that's not very creative, I don't like it. And so we start to believe that. I think this idea that creativity can't be taught comes from a historical perspective, partly because we are so used to the way that creativity is talked about in relation to things like Shakespeare talking about the muse in his sonnets, or the romantic poets, the Coleridge and Blake, talking about waiting for the muse. And so even prior to that, if you read how the Greeks and the Romans talked about creativity, and Elizabeth Gilbert writes brilliantly about this, she talks about creativity always being seen as something that is external to ourselves. So the Greeks and Romans believed that creativity was visited upon you literally by a kind of sprite or demon. But as we sit here in 2016, we know so much more now about the brain and obviously the advent of psychology, and we can study what's actually going on when someone is being creative using MRI scanners and so on. And Ben Martinoga, the neuroscientist, has worked with me to talk about this in detail in the book. So we know so much more about how it is an internal process rather than being an external process and something that we can affect ourselves. So this is a really interesting and really complex question. Is it about gender bias? Is it about sexism? Is it about choice? Is it about women opting out for themselves, or about being managed out? And I think there's no short and quick answer to this question. In the book, I've interviewed Cindy Gallop, who is has a very strong point of view on this, and also about how business should be related to purpose. And in my personal experience, working as a creative director, it was definitely a decision to opt out due to a whole host of reasons. But partly it was a lack of role models in my industry, which is the PR industry, and in the advertising industry. This is an issue which has spawned the rise of a conference called the 3% Conference, which Cindy is the keynote speaker at every year, and is a very, as I say, a very, very complex issue. I think one of the things also from my personal experience in relation to this is partly about, obviously it's about women having families and opting out when they do that. It's part of a bigger discussion also about gender. There aren't enough women on boards generally, outside obviously the media and communications industry, but on boards generally, and women having to make those decisions when they have families, because still, even at this point in time, so many companies just not set up for women to have families and to work in senior leadership positions too. It goes into a bigger point, which is about diversity in general, and diversity is so key for creativity. So that's not just about gender, that's about race, that's about social class, that's about people coming from all sorts of different perspectives to help the creative process. This has been widely written about and I refer to in the book as in order to avoid the enemy of creativity, which is something called comfortable clone syndrome. And we tend to hire and work with people who are like us, who fit the culture, that are in whatever organisation we're in order not to actually have clashes. But that dissent and debate can be really, really important. That different perspective can be really important for creativity. It's in fact an essential element.